Okay, so if your organization relies on external providers for, well, pretty much anything critical these days, IT support, maybe payroll, cloud stuff, even, a tiny part in a big supply chain, you're making a trade-off. It's calculated, you get efficiency, you get scale, expertise, but you are fundamentally bringing external risk into your house. And we see this go wrong a lot, catastrophically sometimes. Big retailers suddenly knocked offline by a breach that wasn't even theirs to begin with, or massive financial hits from a vendor messing up. Sometimes the whole global economy gets gummed up because one supplier, maybe one nobody really tracked, has a problem. So today we're doing a really critical deep dive into third-party risk management, TPRM. And look, this is way more than just ticking compliance boxes. It's about auditing the very foundations of how you outsource, really, to ensure you can survive and stay resilient. To help us navigate this, we've gathered some really detailed stuff. We've got governance guidance from the Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA, some sharp legal analysis on indemnity clauses, which are crucial, discussions on MSP liability, who pays when things go wrong, and a big case study. The fallout between Marks & Spencer and Tata Consultancy Services, TCS. That one's a doozy. Our mission for you, the listener, is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack what top-tier organizations absolutely must do to audit and control their vendor risk systematically, repeatably, and crucially, how contracts, liability limits, all that legal stuff is shifting fast because of these massive cyber disasters we keep seeing. We need to know what to put in those contracts now to protect ourselves later. But before we dive into the frameworks, a quick thank you to our partners. This deep dive is supported by CISOmarketplace.com and vrm.cisomarketplace.services. These are the resources companies rely on to manage vendor risk efficiently, run assessments, keep that vital vendor master file up to date. As we talk about the huge governance load of TPRM, just keep in mind tools like these are essential for actually doing what we're about to discuss.
Right. So starting at the very beginning, we need to be clear on what we're managing. The IIA defines risk as, let me get the wording right, the possibility of an event occurring that will have an impact on the achievement of objectives. Simple enough on the surface. But when you outsource those objectives, maybe data management, to a cloud provider, the risk doesn't just, poof, disappear. It changes shape. It becomes external risk. But, and this is the key point, the ultimate responsibility for managing it, that stays firmly with your organization.
Okay, and right away it gets messy, doesn't it? Because it's not just the company you sign the contract with.
Exactly. That's where oversight gets complicated fast. The risk exposure goes way beyond your direct partner, your third party. It flows down to what the IIA calls the subservice organization, or what most people call the fourth party.
Fourth party?
Yeah, that's a company your third party hires to do some or all of the work you outsource to them in the first place.
Okay, so, if we hire an MSP, a managed service provider, and they subcontract their basic help desk calls to some other company, that help desk is our fourth party, and we have to worry about them even though we don't pay them directly.
Oh, right.
That sounds hard. Like trying to herd cats you can't even see.
It is exactly like that. And honestly, that's where a lot of TPRM programs fall down. Think about it like building a house. You hire a general contractor, that's your third party. They hire an electrician, that's your fourth party. If that electrician uses dodgy wiring and your house burns down, well, the general contractor might be liable to you legally, but your house is still gone. The only way to manage it is to bake the right to oversee that electrician, that fourth party, into your initial contract with the general contractor. If you're not tracking those fourth parties, you've got massive blind spots, dangerous ones. They can undermine your operations, your reputation, everything.
So internal audit's role here is huge then. They're not just compliance checkers. They're mapping this whole tangled web of risk against how much pain the organization can stomach.
Precisely. Internal audit has a two-part mandate here. First, they have to really understand the organization's own TPRM program. How is it structured? Who does what? Second, they need to understand how that program lines up with the company's overall risk appetite. How much risk is the board willing to accept? Their ultimate goal is assurance, making sure the organization is protected from taking on unnecessary risk while still getting the benefits, the value from those vendor relationships. If the risk from a key vendor outweighs the efficiency gain, well, that relationship fails the risk appetite test. An internal audit needs to be able to show that, quantify it. And to do that job effectively, the whole governance structure needs a solid foundation, professionalism. Internal audit practice isn't just guesswork, it's guided globally by mandatory elements. You've got the core principles, the definition of internal auditing, the code of ethics, and the international standards. These aren't just suggestions on a shelf, they're required. They're the intellectual bedrock for any serious internal audit function.
Okay, so when those auditors turn their attention specifically to the TPRM framework itself, what are the absolute must-haves, the things that, if they're missing or weak, spell trouble?
Well, the list of things auditors need to confirm are robustly in place and enforce is pretty long. But let's focus on four absolutely critical components, things that just have to be there. First, and this is paramount, you need a comprehensive, always updated third-party inventory, the vendor master file. This has to include everyone. Your big cloud provider, sure, but also the company that cuts the grass if they have access to your buildings. If you lose track of who's touching your network, your data, your facilities, you've got an immediate critical control failure right there. Audits often find departments signing up vendors on their own, bypassing the central TPRM office. That's a huge gap. Second, you absolutely must have defined risk rating criteria and a formal documented risk assessment process, and it has to be applied consistently. You can't just decide a critical data processor is medium risk because they're cheaper than the high risk alternative. The criteria need to be objective, ideally quantifiable, and tied directly to the potential impact on the business if something goes wrong. Third, there have to be clear, measurable expectations for the controls you expect from your third parties. Minimum cybersecurity standards, physical access rules, data handling protocols. These aren't just suggestions. They need to be spelled out clearly and, crucially, baked into the contract so they're enforceable. And finally, number 4, specific reporting requirements for third-party risk exposures. This isn't just reporting within IT or procurement. This information has to flow up all the way to the board and senior management, usually summarized for risk committees. The board needs a clear aggregated view, not just we have 500 vendors, but here are our top 5 highest risks, here's what happened last quarter, and here's what we're doing about it. It takes TPRM from a technical compliance task to a core business risk discussion.
Right, and that vendor master file you mentioned, the inventory, that seems like the gateway to everything else. Once you know who they are, then you can start managing the relationship through its entire life. The IIA guidance lays out a formal life cycle, doesn't it? 6 phases that internal audit needs to look at systematically. There's sourcing, then due diligence, contracting, monitoring, issue resolution, and finally, termination. You can't just jump around, skip a step, and risk starts piling up.
And we really need to spend some time on due diligence. This is often where organizations try to take shortcuts. They treat it like a one-and-done checkbox exercise when they first sign the vendor up. But the sources are really clear on this. Due diligence has to be comprehensive, yes, but also ongoing, continuous. And the level of effort has to match the risk level. A high-risk vendor, that needs constant, pretty intrusive oversight. A low-risk one, maybe just an annual check-in is enough.
So, if internal audit is reviewing that due diligence process, what kind of questions should they see being asked? What determines if a vendor is even eligible to work with you?
They need to see evidence of stability, financial health, and increasingly character. So the basic questions start with money. Is the company solvent? What's their cash flow look like? Auditors should expect to see recent financial statements reviewed. Look for stability, yes, but also look for signs of instability. Are they potentially going to be taken over? That matters because a change in ownership completely resets the risk picture. Have they been involved in major lawsuits, regulatory fines, civil penalties? Say, in the last 5 years, auditors need to see that paper trail showing financial health and integrity, or lack thereof.
And it's going beyond just the numbers and certs now, right? The really mature organizations are digging into the ethical side, the reputation.
Absolutely. That ethical layer is moving quickly from being a sort of nice extra to a core part of leading practice. You need to actively gather media coverage, good and bad. Look for lawsuits, regulatory actions, public statements. You're trying to get a feel for the third party's actual conduct, their corporate culture, their values. Do they align with your company's values? Especially if they're interacting with your customers, like a call center. You need to know who you're associating your brand with.
You mentioned using the UN Global Compact principles as a framework for scoring this. Can we walk through that ABC Consulting example again? I think that really makes it tangible.
Yeah, let's use that hypothetical ABC Consulting case. So imagine they're being assessed against the UN Global Compact's 10 principles. These cover human rights, labor standards, environmental impact, and anti-corruption. A savvy auditor doesn't just see these as checkboxes. They're leverage points for risk assessment. So for ABC Consulting, maybe they scored low risk on labor protections because they mostly operate in countries with strong employment laws. Okay, good start. But then the auditor looks at the environmental principle. ABC's whole business model involves consultants flying all over the world 5 days a week. Huge number of air miles, hotel stays, massive carbon footprint, that high travel footprint. That translates directly into a medium environmental risk. Let's call it risk level 2. Why? Because their normal operations could expose their client you to negative press or criticism from environmental groups or stakeholders.
That's really interesting. It's not about their data security at all. It's a side effect of how they do business. What about the anti-corruption part in that example?
The auditor flagged a medium risk there too. Let's say ABC Consulting has a really strong internal code of conduct, explicitly forbidding bribery. Great policy on paper. But their sales teams are constantly working in countries that are known globally for high levels of corruption, high scores on bribery indices. So the auditor concludes that even though the policy is good, the exposure from just operating in those geographies is significant enough to warrant closer monitoring, especially around things like gift-giving policies, interactions with local officials. TPRM means digging into these operational realities and using objective frameworks like the UN Compact to make something subjective like ethical conduct more measurable.
That's a great illustration of turning operations and ethics into a concrete risk score. So let's just formalize those standard risk levels we keep mentioning: high, medium, low. What do they actually mean in terms of potential impact? Because that score drives everything else, right?
It absolutely does. Everything flows from that risk rating.
Okay, starting at the top, high risk. If something goes wrong with a high-risk vendor, what are we looking at?
We're looking at potentially extensive regulatory fines. Major financial loss, the kind that shows up significantly on the balance sheet. Massive reputational damage that could take years, literally years to repair. And major losses for your account holders or customers, think class action lawsuits. Key services will definitely be impacted, and getting things fixed could take a long time, weeks, maybe even months. This is the really catastrophic scenario.
Right. Then medium risk. Exposure here means moderate financial or account holder losses. Your customers might notice the problem. They'll probably complain about it. You might see some negative chatter on social media. You could still face regulatory fines, but they'd likely have only minor impacts on the company's overall earnings. And crucially, resolution is expected within a defined, shorter time frame, maybe a few days, possibly less.
And low risk, that's the other end of the scale. Low risk means exposure to some financial or customer impact, but it's likely to have very low visibility to your customers. The timeline to fix things should be really short hours, not days. And critically, an incident here wouldn't result in regulatory fines or lawsuits. These are usually vendors providing non-essential services, things that are easily replaceable if needed. This set of criteria, high, medium, low, forms the basis of your risk matrix. You map the criticality of the service against the potential business impact.
And managing all of this, the vendor list, the risk scores, the ongoing checks, the reporting up to the board, that sounds like it requires a pretty sophisticated system, especially if you're dealing with hundreds, maybe thousands of these third and fourth parties.
Oh, it absolutely does. You simply cannot maintain this level of continuous oversight, assessment, and inventory tracking using, spreadsheets and shared drives anymore. The sheer volume of data, the need for continuous updates, it just overwhelms manual processes very quickly.
So as organizations are trying to get their arms around all this complexity sourcing, continuous due diligence, they really do need robust platforms, tools to manage that massive vendor master file, automate assessments where possible, track performance against all these metrics: financial, ethical, operational.
Exactly. These comprehensive tools are what turn TPRM from what could be a messy, reactive compliance headache into a proactive, enforceable, living risk management program. It's about having the right system to support the process.
And these kinds of tools are available at CISOmarketplace.com and vrm.cisomarketplace.services, really helping organizations achieve the level of diligence we're outlining today.
Okay, so let's transition from due diligence into contracting. The contract itself. It's not just a legal formality you sign and file away. It is arguably the organization's single most important control in the entire relationship. Yeah. It's the blueprint. It's where you formally communicate your risk appetite and define the absolute minimum standards of internal control you expect from that third party. If it's not clearly defined in the contract, you basically have zero leverage to enforce it later on.
And within that contract, probably the most powerful lever for internal audit is the right to audit clause. Auditors need to fight for a strong version of this, right? Ensuring they can get the access they need to data, to systems. But I imagine vendors push back hard on this.
Oh, they do. Constantly. Enforcing the right to audit is often a battle. Third parties have all sorts of tactics to try and resist or water it down. They might try to charge you really high fees for your auditor's time or even just for accessing the data itself, essentially making you pay to check their homework. They might refuse on-site access, insisting that, the relationship manager can do a limited review instead of letting your independent auditors in with their specialized tools. Management needs to anticipate this resistance and make sure the contract language is crystal clear and strong enough to overcome it.
Okay, let's get specific then. What makes a right to audit clause truly robust? We can't just have vague language like, we can audit you. What needs to be nailed down?
The devil really is in the details here. First, the notification period. It needs to be specific, state the number of days. Don't just say reasonable notice. And if you want the ability to perform unannounced or surprise audits, which can be essential for things like fraud detection, that has to be explicitly stated and agreed to in the contract. Second, the scope of access needs precise definition. You need the right to access original documentation and data, physical or logical, not just summaries or reports the vendor prepares for you. And you need the right to use standard audit software against their data files. This stops them from just showing you the clean version. You need to see the raw stuff to do a real audit. Third, the location scope. It must be defined broadly. The audit right should cover any location, physical or logical, where your data can be accessed, viewed, or potentially manipulated. If the vendor subcontracts some development work to a facility overseas, that facility needs to be in scope, even if access is logically restricted. Just the ability to view the data is enough to trigger the audit right for that location.
And crucially, looping back to what we discussed earlier, the contract have to address that fourth-party risk directly.
Absolutely critical. The contract must require the vendor to flow down these exact same audit rights and conditions without weakening them or adding extra costs to all subcontractors or fourth parties they use for your services. If your vendor uses a major cloud provider, you need a contractual path through your vendor to audit the physical security of that cloud data center using your vendor's audit rights. If you don't have visibility down the entire chain, that fourth-party risk is just sitting there unmanaged and potentially very dangerous.
Okay, related to audits, what about those third-party assurance reports, things like SOC reports, ISA reports? Companies often seem to grab a copy of a Type 2 report and think, okay, due diligence done. Why is that a potentially dangerous oversimplification?
Yeah, that's a common mistake, and it can be a serious one. Look, these assurance reports are definitely helpful, but they only provide a snapshot, not the whole movie. And you need to understand the difference between the two main types. A Type 1 report. That basically includes the vendor's description of their controls and an independent auditor's opinion on whether those controls are designed suitably, but only at a specific point in time. Critically, a Type 1 report gives no opinion on whether the controls actually worked effectively over any period. It's just about the design, the blueprint. A Type 2 report is more valuable. It includes all the Type 1 information, plus the results of the independent auditor actually testing those controls to see if they operated effectively over a period of time, usually 6 months or a year. So it validates performance, not just the design. Much better.
So even the Type 2, which includes testing, isn't a complete substitute for your own due diligence. Why not?
Several reasons. First, even a Type 2 is still a point-in-time assessment, or rather, an assessment over a past period. Risk changes constantly. What was true 6 months ago might not be true today. Second, these reports often have carve-outs areas that were specifically excluded from the scope. Maybe critical fourth parties weren't included. You have to read the scope section carefully. Third, you really need to scrutinize the independence and competence of the audit firm that issued the report. Are they reputable? Do they have conflicts of interest? Have they faced disciplinary action? And finally, you have to consider the vendor's performance outside the specific audit period covered by the report. Did they have a major breach 2 months before the audit period started? The SOC report won't tell you that. So yeah, assurance reports are necessary evidence, but they're just one piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture.
Okay, let's pivot to financial accountability. When the worst happens, data gets breached, systems go down, lawsuits start flying, how does the contract actually divvy up the financial pain? This gets us into indemnity clauses and those tricky liability caps.
Right, indemnity is absolutely critical here. It's basically a contractual promise where one party agrees to cover the losses or damages suffered by the other party under specific circumstances. Particularly, it often deals with claims from third parties like customers filing a class action lawsuit or regulators imposing fines after a breach. It works alongside the vendor's liability insurance, defining who pays for what when things really go sideways. Now, the main battleground when negotiating these clauses is usually the liability cap. Vendors, understandably, always want to limit their maximum financial exposure. They push for a cap, a maximum dollar amount they could ever be liable for under the contract. Often, they try to tie this cap to the total contract value, or very commonly for service providers, the fees paid over a certain period, like 12 months.
And this is where super precise wording in the contract becomes make or break, isn't it? It could be the difference between a vendor facing a manageable loss versus a potentially company-ending one. Like if an MSP charges, say, $5,000 a month for their actual services, but over the last year, they also resold $500,000 worth of hardware and software licenses to the client. A vaguely worded 12-month cap could be disastrous for them.
It's a huge, huge issue. If that cap just says something vague like liability limited to total fees paid in the preceding 12 months, and the MSP has invoiced $60,000 in service fees plus $500,000 of hardware-software pass-through costs, well, a smart client-side lawyer is going to argue that total fees paid means everything on the invoices. Suddenly, that MSP's perceived $60,000 liability cap just exploded to $560,000, or potentially even more. So MSPs and vendors generally have to be incredibly specific. The language needs to limit liability explicitly to fees earned for managed services rendered, or similar phrasing. It must clearly exclude the cost of any hardware, software, or other third-party items they simply resold or passed through. Getting that phrase fees earned for managed services nailed down is absolutely non-negotiable if the vendor wants meaningful protection from the cap.
But even with a really well-defined, tightly scoped cap, clients aren't completely out of luck if the vendor messes up spectacularly, are they? There are legal exceptions where those caps might not hold up in court.
That's right. There are crucial exceptions, often related to extreme failures in performance. The two big ones you absolutely need to understand are willful misconduct and gross negligence. It's vital to know the difference and why courts often view these as overriding contractual limitations. Okay. So willful misconduct implies intent. It means the vendor intentionally did something wrong, knowing it was wrong or would likely cause harm or breach the contract. Think of a vendor deliberately deleting critical data they were contractually obligated to preserve. That's active wrongdoing. Gross negligence, on the other hand, isn't about intending harm, but it's about extreme carelessness. It's a reckless disregard for the basic standards of care expected in that situation. It goes far beyond a simple mistake or ordinary negligence. For example, maybe an MSP gets repeated urgent security alerts about a critical vulnerability for months and just ignores them, doesn't patch. And then, surprise, they get hit with ransomware exploiting that exact vulnerability. A judge might look at that and say, that wasn't just a mistake, that was gross negligence. The liability cap doesn't apply here. The law tends to view these extreme failures, willful misconduct, and gross negligence as fundamentally undermining the good faith basis of the contract itself. So judges often have the discretion to award damages far exceeding the contractual cap in these cases. That's why keeping these exceptions in the contract is so critical for the client. They provide recourse for the truly egregious failures.
Okay, shifting from financial penalties to performance itself. We need service-level agreements, SLAs. These are more like the day-to-day rules of engagement, right? Setting expectations, managing performance, hopefully resolving issues before we ever get near indemnity clauses.
Exactly. SLAs are essential for operational clarity. They need to clearly spell out accountability. What exactly is the MSP responsible for? Network uptime, server patching, and just as importantly, what are they not responsible for? Like issues within a specific third-party software application they don't manage? Setting these boundaries protects everyone's time and prevents finger-pointing later, and they rely on specific, measurable metrics that clients need to understand.
Let's define some of those key metrics that really should be in any SLA for a critical service.
Okay, some common and important ones. We often rely on mean time between failures, or MTBF. This applies to systems that can be repaired, like a server. It measures the average time the system runs successfully between breakdowns. Then there's mean time to failure, MTTF. This is for things that can't be repaired, like a hard drive, you just replace it. It measures the average lifespan. These metrics, MTBF and MTTF, help set baseline expectations for how often things might naturally fail, even in a well-managed environment. If an MSP promises, say, 99.9% uptime, these numbers help quantify what that actually means in terms of expected minutes or hours of downtime per year. And then, when something does fail, you need mean time to repair, or MTTR. This is crucial. It's the average time it took from when an outage is detected until the service is fully restored. Setting realistic, contractually binding MTTR targets is vital. It stops customer frustration boiling over during an incident because expectations are clear. If the contract guarantees, say, a 4-hour MTTR for a critical system failure, then the provider is legally obligated to have the resources, staffing, spares, procedures in place to actually meet that target. It dictates their internal readiness.
And if they don't meet those targets, what about the penalties? What gives the SLA its teeth?
Penalties have to be clearly defined and enforceable. We generally see three main types. First, straightforward financial penalties. The provider pays agreed-upon cash damages for missing the SLA. Second, service credits. These are very common, especially in cloud services. The provider gives the customer credit against future bills, maybe reimbursing the cost of the service during the outage period. Vendors often prefer this because no actual cash changes hands. Third, you might see license extension or similar remedies where the provider extends the service term or offers additional support hours at no extra charge to compensate for the failure. Internal audit needs to look at the contract and assess whether the penalty structure is actually meaningful and appropriate for the potential impact of non-performance. A tiny service credit for a major outage might not be a sufficient deterrent.
That need for structure and rigor is so critical because when it's missing, the real-world fallout can be fast and painful. Let's look at a couple of cautionary tales now that really drive home the cost when internal communication or contractual oversight fails. First up, the failure to bring in the experts early enough. We have this example of a small credit union. They contracted a vendor to set up a new electronic funds transfer service for their members. Now, the project team involved, they were trying to do the right thing, compliance-wise. They made sure all the required forms got filled out and submitted for the vendor management program checklist.
Right, they ticked the boxes. But they completely missed the spirit of TPRM, the actual risk management part. And here's the critical mistake. That project team never consulted an IT subject matter expert, an SME, during the crucial due diligence and, importantly, the contracting phases. It was only after the contract was signed, when the IT department was finally brought in just to grant the vendor network access, that someone technical asked the basic security questions that should have been front and center months earlier.
And what did that late-stage review uncover about the contract they'd already signed?
Oh, it was a complete mess from a security and risk perspective. The contract was missing fundamental security provisions. It offered zero guarantees about the quality of the vendor's cybersecurity practices. And, critically, it had absolutely no clause addressing what would happen if the vendor's systems were breached, potentially exposing all that sensitive member financial data. Huge oversight. On top of that, the contract didn't even specify if the member data would be securely deleted or returned at the end of the service, leaving a massive data retention risk hanging out there indefinitely.
So they were stuck with this insecure contract, data potentially exposed, and then the exit clause turned out to be the final nail in the coffin.
Exactly. The termination clause, which, again, clearly hadn't been properly vetted by legal or IT SMEs, had this nasty little provision. It stated that if the credit union terminated the contract for any reason at all before the end of the 5-year term, they would owe the vendor all the remaining licensing and operating fees for the full 5 years, plus an additional estimated amount representing all the future revenue the vendor might have lost because members wouldn't be using the service. It created an exit cost that was exponentially higher than the actual value of the service itself. It's just a textbook case. Failure to integrate the right experts early in due diligence and contracting leads directly to massive, expensive, legally binding risk exposure.
That kind of failure leads us right into one of the most high-profile, most consequential supply chain cyber failures we've seen recently, the Marks & Spencer versus Tata Consultancy Services situation. This case gives us some really critical insights into the new reality vendors face regarding reputation.
Yeah, the M&S cyber attack happened over the Easter weekend in 2025. It was bad. M&S had to immediately shut down all online orders for their clothing and home departments. Getting back online fully took almost 2 months, well into June. The financial hit, the market reaction, it was staggering.
And we really need to underscore the scale of that damage. The estimates were around $300 million in lost operating profit for M&S in the following financial year. And at the peak of the crisis, something like $750 million was wiped off their market value. Being unable to sell clothes online for 46 days. In today's retail world, that's almost unthinkable, a body blow.
And the spotlight, fairly or unfairly, fell heavily on TCS. They had been providing M&S with essential service desk functions for over 10 years. TCS reacted quickly, launched an internal investigation, and by June 2025, they announced their conclusion. Their own systems were not the initial entry point for the attack, and no TCS systems or users were compromised. They very publicly maintained their technical innocence, arguing the breach must have started somewhere else in the M&S environment.
But despite that claim of being technically cleared, the service desk contract between M&S and TCS ended just a month later, in July 2025.
Yeah.
Now, TCS insisted the timing was purely coincidental, saying the separation was clearly unrelated to the breach, because M&S had actually started a competitive bidding process, an RFP, way back in January 2025, before the attack, and had already chosen other suppliers.
Right. Whether that termination was truly pre-planned or accelerated by the incident, the perception in the industry, the skepticism, it lingers. And this brings us to the absolute core insight that the sources really hammer home from this case. In today's threat landscape, technical innocence is often not enough. Even if a vendor can credibly claim their systems weren't breached, that they weren't the technical weak link, the sheer reputational damage, the contamination from being associated with such a massive, costly failure like the M&S incident, it can be fatal to the client relationship.
Why is that? Why does that shift happen? Why would a board ditch a vendor they've maybe used successfully for a decade, even if that vendor can prove they weren't technically at fault for the breach?
It really boils down to optics, perception, and accountability, especially under pressure. When a company suffers a huge public failure like M&S did, the board is under immense scrutiny from shareholders, regulators, the public. They often feel compelled to take visible, decisive action. Terminating a major provider who was involved, even peripherally, sends a strong message. We are taking this seriously, we are making changes. Holding on to a vendor whose name is now linked to a $300 million loss, regardless of the technical details. From a board-level risk management perspective, that's often just too politically toxic. Reputational risk suddenly trumps technical facts. And we're seeing this shift towards greater vendor accountability across the board. Look at the Mastani law firm lawsuit against their MSP, Lantec LLC. They sued for over $1 million in damages after a ransomware attack. Cases like this are setting new precedents. They show that MSPs and other critical vendors are increasingly being held financially liable, pushing back hard against the old days where vendor liability was often minimal or kept very low.
And the real kicker, the Achilles heel that connects the M&S situation to this broader trend, wasn't necessarily a sophisticated technical exploit, but something much more fundamental.
That's perhaps the most critical point of all. The M&S breach, according to reports, didn't succeed by finding some obscure flaw in a firewall or an unpatched server. It apparently relied heavily on social engineering, exploiting the human element, specifically targeting the staff within the outsourced help desk function provided by TCS. Think about what a help desk does. They handle password resets, they unlock accounts, they grant access permissions. You are, by definition, outsourcing a critical security control point when you outsource your help desk.
Which means, if that outsourced team, even if their own computers are secure, is the place where a clever phisher or social engineer tricks someone into giving up credentials or access, then the vendor's claim of, our systems weren't breached, starts to sound pretty hollow, doesn't it? They fail to secure the human boundary they were contracted to manage.
Precisely. That failure to adequately train, monitor, and secure the human element, the support staff, who are often prime targets for social engineering, becomes a massive vulnerability. And regulatory pressure is only amplifying this focus. Things like the EU's NIS2 directive, which is coming into full force, explicitly demand rigorous vendor risk assessments and continuous monitoring of the entire supply chain. This regulatory climate effectively makes vendor oversight a non-delegable responsibility that goes right up to the board. Technical security isn't enough. Managing the human risk factor within your vendors is now mandatory.
So this really pushes organizations beyond just doing, say, an annual check or looking at a vendor's PDF assessment. It demands more continuous real-time insight into vendor risk.
Absolutely. Guidance from bodies like the NCSC in the UK emphasizes embedding security throughout the entire supplier lifecycle. Starting with much better due diligence before you even sign the contract, really digging into a supplier's cybersecurity track record, their history of breaches, if any. Then, you need systems to continuously score and categorize your suppliers based on risk. And most importantly, you need to validate their self-assessments or formal reports with actual real-time cyber monitoring data. What does that mean practically? It means monitoring things like criminal forums for chatter about the vendor, checking paste sites for leaked credentials associated with their domain, tracking known vulnerabilities in the software they use. You need to correlate all that external threat intelligence with your internal assessments to get a unified, actionable risk picture for each vendor. This allows you to track risk dynamically, triage problems quickly, and push back effectively on vendors who might look clean on paper but are actually showing signs of exposure online. And again, managing that level of data aggregation and correlation, that really requires the specialized platforms we talked about earlier. You can't do that effectively with manual processes.
Okay, let's go ahead and pull all these threads together now. For the listener trying to audit or improve their own TPRM program, what are the absolute key takeaways from everything we've discussed?
All right, I think there are three main headlines. First, third-party risk isn't optional. It must be managed proactively through a structured, auditable life cycle from the moment you think about sourcing a vendor right through to when you terminate the relationship. And remember, that risk definition has to include your fourth parties. You've got to map your entire relevant supply chain.
Second, the contract is king. It's your primary control, not just legal boilerplate. It needs a strong, specific right-to-audit clause allowing real access to original data. And those indemnity clauses and liability caps, they need meticulous drafting. Scope the caps carefully, ideally limiting them just to service fees while making sure you retain those crucial exceptions for gross negligence and willful misconduct.
And third, the M&S and TCS situation really highlights a fundamental shift. In today's hyper-aware environment, reputation is paramount. Technical innocence often isn't a shield anymore. If a vendor is associated with a major breach, especially one exploiting the human element they were supposed to manage, the reputational fallout can kill the relationship, regardless of where the initial technical compromise occurred. Accountability is swinging decisively towards the vendor.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. The sheer complexity of cybersecurity and supply chain risk today means organizations have to constantly reevaluate the true cost of outsourcing. It's not just about the potential cost of a catastrophic failure like that 300 million M&S hit. It's also about the ongoing significant cost of building and maintaining the comprehensive, continuous, multi-layered governance structure you need just to protect yourself from that failure, that persistent governance cost. That's the real mandatory price of achieving resilience when so much of your operation relies on others. And if today's deep dive made it clear that maybe you need better structure, better tools to manage that true cost effectively, remember that robust platforms designed for continuous vendor risk management are really essential to achieve the kind of diligence we've been talking about. So we want to thank CISOmarketplace.com and vrm.cisomarketplace.services one last time for supporting this discussion. We hope you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the critical issues shaping our business and technology landscape.